Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. I want to go ahead and keep week 62 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. But before I get back to Letter 210, just a reminder for those of you watching or listening to this episode on the day of release in the U.S. Today is November 4th. That's Election Day 2024. Now, you know I keep politics out of my shows, and that isn't going to change. But if you haven't done so yet, please go and vote. Now, let's get to Tolkien Tuesday. Over the last 3 weeks, we've looked closely at Letter 210 and the various concerns, if you want to call them that Tolkien has expressed about a proposed Zimmerman adaptation. Pretty sure we're not going to finish this week, but let's see how much further we get. Now, we start with registered complaint number 22, though we never see numbers 1, 3, 5, 6, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, or 18. That's 10 of the previous 21 complaints that aren't even in this letter, which must have been several pages long. Anyway, number 22 is about lembas, the waybread of the elves, and boy does Tolkien have thoughts about the fact that Zimmerman has erroneously described lembas as a food concentrate. Now, Tolkien explains that while he certainly dislikes the style and feature of French fairy stories, things I'm guessing like the delicate spires and tiny minarets we talked about last week, he also dislikes equally any pull towards scientification, of which this expression is an example. I mean, yeah, I think Saruman alone is evidence that he dislikes that scientification. Here, though, the idea of finding some real-world explanation for why a man can survive a full day on a bite of lembas runs counter to the whole point of elves. Tolkien continues, no analysis in any laboratory would discover chemical properties of lembas that made it superior to other cakes of wheatmeal. That's not a science thing, it's an elf thing. Now, interestingly, Tolkien gives Zimmerman a bit of an out here, saying that his comment is only based on the attitude, and that he is certain that nothing of this kind or style will, I hope, escape into the actual dialogue. Let us hope not. Now, lembas being very important to Tolkien, he still has more to say, explaining his two in-story purposes for lembas. The first is that elvish waybread is, according to Tolkien, a machine or device for making credible the long marches with little provision, in a world in which, as I have said, miles are miles. He then dismisses that reason as being relatively unimportant, before giving us the real significance of lembas. It also has a much larger significance of what one might hesitatingly call a religious kind, he writes. This becomes later apparent, especially in the chapter Mount Doom. Now, let's look at that reference because it is really important to what Tolkien says. The lembas had a virtue without which they would long ago have lain down to die. It did not satisfy desire, and at times Sam's mind was filled with the memories of food and the longing for simple bread and meats. And yet this waybread of the elves had a potency that increased as travelers relied on it alone and did not mingle it with other foods. It fed the will, and it gave strength to endure, and to master sinew and limb beyond the measure of mortal kind. And then, in Letter 213, Tolkien points out that some have seen waybread, lembas, as viaticum, and the reference to its feeding the will and being more potent when fasting, a derivation from the Eucharist. Not a surprise, since the definition of the word viaticum is provision for a journey, and lembas literally means journey bread. I say all that to say that Zimmerman needs to tread carefully here. In fact, Tolkien says that since Zimmerman hasn't even used lembas for its first purpose, that is, as a device for making credible those long marches with little provision, thanks to the whole of Mount Doom disappearing in the distorted confusion that Zimmerman has made of the ending, Tolkien's words, lembas, according to Tolkien, might as well disappear altogether. Now, before we move on to Tolkien's complaints about parts 2 and 3 of the proposed storyline, I want to read a short paragraph at the end of this complaint, even though it's not specifically about lembas. It's certainly insightful into Tolkien and adaptations. I do earnestly hope that in the assignment of actual speeches to the characters, they will be represented as I have presented them, in style and sentiment. I should resent perversion of the characters, and do resent it so far as it appears in this sketch, even more than the spoiling of the plot and scenery. That's very helpful to us in looking at that Shippey test. Is the change a change that is necessary due to the change in medium? And does it miss the core of the original? Well, clearly the characters are even more important to the core of the original for Tolkien than the plot itself. Now, what he says next must have been hard to read. Tolkien explains that he has spent all this time criticizing both large things and small details in Part 1, because at least Part 1, in general, respects the line of narrative in the book and retains some of its original coherence. Uh-oh, I can almost hear the other shoe dropping now. Tolkien continues, Part 2 exemplifies all the faults of Part 1, but it is far more unsatisfactory, and still more so Part 3 in more serious respects. In other words, it's all downhill from here. Tolkien surmises that Zimmerman, having spent much time and work on Part 1, now found himself short not only of space, but of patience to deal with the two more difficult volumes in which the action becomes more fast and complicated. He has, in any case, elected to treat them in a way that produces a confusion that mounts at last almost to a delirium, he says. Now, it's partly because of how Zimmerman treated the two branches of the story from here. And before we leave, I want to read what Tolkien said regarding this split. He writes, the narrative now divides into two main branches: prime action, the ring bearers, and subsidiary action, the rest of the company, leading to the heroic matter. It is essential that these two branches should each be treated in coherent sequence, both to render them intelligible as a story and because they are totally different in tone and scenery. Jumbling them together entirely destroys these things. Now, that is an interesting criticism because the Jackson films, specifically The Two Towers, did away with Tolkien's technique of narrative interlacing, which involves those separate but connected plot lines told independently, typically with minimal knowledge of what's happening in the other plot lines, and instead replaced it with cross-cutting and other techniques. Now, this let viewers follow the multiple storylines at the same time, instead of having to piece it together as the timelines converge, diverge, and leapfrog one another. Now, for the most part, at least in my own opinion as a viewer and a Tolkien fan, that decision worked well for the films. I mean, it certainly wasn't my biggest gripe, Faramir, but Tolkien clearly has different thoughts. For now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week for more letters from Tolkien as we move on to specific complaints in parts 2 and 3 of Zimmerman's adaptation, and hopefully wrap up our time in letter 210. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about here. You also can support the show, get an ad-free episode feed, and a bonus episode every week. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe on your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.